been called over to this aquarium to have a little chat about phosphate levels. So what we'll do now is just go through all the facets of phosphate and just give you a little bit of an unwrapping of various causes, cures and solutions for issues with phosphate. Now it's inevitable, particularly with an aquarium with as many fish as this, that you're going to end up with phosphate in the water. And there's various ways that you can get the phosphate down. Water changes will help. And then there's various phosphate removing products like resin and so forth that come in little filter bags and so forth that you can put into the filter. There's various filter mats that remove phosphate. And there's also products such as this one. And so this is Reef Revolution's Phosphate X. Now, if you dose that daily to a recommended dose and you keep an eye on your phosphate level, then this will slowly bond and drop the phosphate out of salt. That will drop the phosphate level. But I also recommend using polyfilter at the same time because the polyfilter is going to remove the residual. There's also various other means that you can use, such as carbon dosing. So whether it be bio pellets or various carbon-based additives that you can preferably put on a dosing pump that can also help to control your phosphates. And the amount of food and the type of food that you feed makes a massive impact as well. Now, the food that you feed will make a massive impact on your phosphate levels. And the main thing that phosphate will do is encourage algae, and it will not help the coral too. The fish don't tend to be too worried by it. But there's a food called probiotics by Spectrum, and that contains an anti-phosphate enzyme, and it's got probiotic bacteria in it, which the probiotic bacteria is very good for the fish's digestion, but when the fish poo, the bacteria in the poo eats the poo. So if you ever experience high phosphates, then that's the food that I'd go straight for, the probiotics by New Life Spectrum. Now, if you do have high phosphates in your water and you want to put corals in your aquarium, particularly if you've got nice fancy lights like these ones, then you've just got to watch what corals you put in. So like, for example, I find that leather corals aren't that bothered by the phosphate as much. Corellas, fluffies, zoanthus, there's a whole bunch of corals that are not as bothered, whereas some of your LPS and definitely a lot of your SPS will be really quite bothered by it. So you don't need, so providing that you're taking some sort of action to get the phosphate down, you don't need to have that as a concrete excuse for why you don't get corals, but you do need to be very aware of what corals you're putting in there, because some corals are far more affected by phosphate than other corals. So the way that I would get the phosphate down on this tank is that I would get a dosing pump down here, and I'd mount the dosing pump in under here. Then I'd have my bottles laid out. I'd have calcium, carbonate, and magnesium. And then I'd have that set on the dosing pump. And I'd systematically be testing the calcium, carbonate, magnesium using a good quality test kit. And then you can slowly turn up or down the settings on your dosing pump until you get those levels right. And then most dosing pumps come in 4. So the other one, if I've got phosphate, I'll tend to use a phosphate remover on the 4th one. And then if I don't have phosphate, I will tend to change to like a carbon dosing, like Nopox. And then I'll use that once I actually get my phosphate down. And that's also going to help with nitrate control. Now, phosphate can be a little bit of a confusing one because phosphate is available in many forms in an aquarium. So there's calcium diphosphate, ionic phosphate, organic phosphate. There's all different types of phosphates. And some of them show up on test kits and some of them don't show up on test kits. So it can actually be the case where you're taking action to improve your water quality, but you're actually finding that your phosphate level appears to be raising. Now, sometimes that can be because the additives that you're putting in to control your phosphates, or whatever action you're taking to control your phosphates, may actually just be changing the state that the phosphates are in, therefore making the phosphates testable. So sometimes it can seem like you're going backwards, but the reason why it might seem like you're going backwards is that what you're doing may be affecting the form that the phosphate's in. So therefore, though you may be improving the situation, you can find that your test results may actually trick you and show the opposite because of the different ways that phosphate is bound within water. And even with algae, because algae is another real indicator of phosphate, because one of the main issues of phosphate, particularly for fish more so than coral, is algae. So it's really not uncommon that somebody might be having a particular issue with algae, then they look for a solution and they end up finding out the phosphate's the problem, and then they start lowering their phosphate only to find that their algae gets worse. And that can happen for two reasons. One is because, once again, whatever you're doing to reduce the phosphate could be changing the state that the phosphate's in, which may be more or less attractive to the algae, therefore may temporarily actually increase the amount of algae that you're getting. The other thing is that the algae also tends to bloom, or different algae tend to grow according to the amount of phosphate in the water. So it's very possible that you decrease your phosphate, and then that may bring it within the perfect parameters for the algae and effectively make the algae worse. So it's often just one step backwards to get two steps forward. So you just need to stay with it. And the one thing that you really need is patience, because any biological change that occurs within the aquarium, you're really looking at a month before you're seeing any difference, and then potentially another month before any sort of resolution or any sort of manageable results. So patience is a big thing. Now, if you're trying to control phosphate, one of the things that is super important, is that you don't just take the good water off the top of the aquarium, because the good water in the water column is likely to be low in phosphate. What you really want to do is use a gravel siphon, and a gravel siphon looks like one of those things that you saw under your dad's bed in the 80s, which is like a thick tube connected to a thin tube, and you just stick that into the gravel, and then you siphon the water out of the aquarium into a bucket, and then the water is going to go through the gravel and suck all the crap out of the gravel, and that's where a lot of your phosphates are bound up. Now, the other thing is that when you start using a gravel cleaner and you start penetrating that sand, your phosphate level is almost definitely going to go up, because a lot of your phosphates are all bound up in the sand. And if they're bound up there and they're not disturbed, then when you go and start your one step forward, two steps backwards, then you'll find that your phosphate level is very likely to actually increase. So what you really want to do is do that regularly. Get your gravel cleaner and do all of your water changes through the gravel. And then eventually, with patience, your phosphate level will go down. But the first few times, if you haven't gravel cleaned that for a long time, then get ready, because when you do gravel clean it, you're going to have a big burst of phosphate. Once again, a lot of the solutions for an aquarium are one step backwards, one step, two steps forward, whatever I'm trying to say. Now, biomedia is something that I have a lot of experience with. Now, there is a biomedia called Marine Pure, and Marine Pure did millions of dollars worth of research for the wastewater industry, and by a biological research company called Nanodynamics, to work out the perfect surface area to volume ratio for the growth of denitrification. Now, no other aquarium media company has that sort of budget. So all of the aquarium media companies basically just do all of their research just based on trying to make it like Marine Pure. But Marine Pure, which is now owned by a company called Samco, have done lots of parallel testing on all of the competing products and found that basically all of them are nothing like their claims. So they claim a certain surface area to volume ratio and all this other stuff, but their claims versus what is actually being achieved is basically so far off that it could only be described as a guess. Not even a guess, because some of them claim very high surface area to volume ratios, other ones claim lower surface area to volume ratios, and in all cases that they experienced, their claims were absolutely far off. Some claim high and are low, some claim low and are high. So the only media that I recommend and use is Marine Pure, and that's because I know that the research has gone into it. All this sort of stuff here, I just take it out. And the reason why I take it out is that these sorts of medias have nitrification without parallel denitrification, and then a lot of these fake Marine Pure medias, they just don't have the correct surface area to volume ratio, just absolutely due to lack of research. So the biological media that I have the absolute best success with and that I have the most confidence in is Marine Pure. So if you don't have Marine Pure in your filter, I would definitely consider getting it. And I've actually found in many cases that removing these shit medias, or I shouldn't say that, the not as researched medias, actually improve my aquarium. Now, a UV sterilizer is really a wonderful tool for reducing pathogens. And for a heavily stocked tank like this one, it's a very good thing to have. But the first thing that we need to be aware of is that there is a quartz sleeve inside that you definitely want to be cleaning at least once a year. And then there's a tube inside it that needs to be replaced at least once a year of use. And it's really important that we have slow flow rate going through it. So you really want about 1 time an hour of your aquarium is going to give you a good kill time. Now, if you have your return pump, and it's a very powerful return pump, and it's running the aquarium several times an hour, then your efficiency of the UV is likely to be very limited because the water is just zooming through it too quickly and it doesn't have enough contact time. So what you actually want to do is have the water move through the UV very slowly, and that'll increase the contact time, therefore expose pathogens to the UVC light, giving the UVC light much better time to actually kill the pathogens. And a lot of the time it doesn't really kill the pathogens, it sort of just sterilizes them. So reducing your flow is great. Now this is quite a fancy pump in here, so you've got the ability to turn the flow down. And if you did want to work out the flow rate, what you can do is just connect a flexible hose to the outlet and then run that down to a 20-litre bucket, then mark 10 litres in the bucket, then turn your pump on, and then see how long it takes to work to do 10 litres. And that's just a Bob's your uncle, better than nothing solution. The other thing to be aware of is the way this aquarium is plumbed. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 potentially elbows, and every single elbow is going to fairly drastically reduce the amount of flow. So you can't just rely on turning your pump down, because you may actually, unless you're actually working out what your flow rate is, and you've either got a flow meter or you just try that good old trick of, and you have to take it out of there. You can't shortcut it down here. It's got to be out of the actual tank itself, and then you can get an estimation of how much water, because with all those elbows, you could be losing a lot of flow. So just doing a little test is maybe a little bit of a pain in the ass, but it's not that bad. So trying to make sure that you've got 1 time an hour water flow is going to be ultimate for your UV sterilizer. And believe it or not, aquaculture studies suggest that 1 time an hour is actually ultimate for your biological filtration as well. So you might think, oh, that's not enough water getting pumped through my filter. But it actually is less is better, because putting more through your filter is just going to decrease contact time of the filter as well. Now, this aquarium has very good water flow in it. So the flow in the fish tank and the dissolved oxygen level and your surface agitation is very good. So the amount of flow through your filter is definitely not the same conversation as the water going in the aquarium. I really want about 20 times an hour in the aquarium and between 1 to maximum 4 times through the actual filter itself. Now, if you're a snail, a really fun thing to do is block up power heads and skimmers. So this little guy here is really cool because he's going to scoot around in this little sump here, but it may only be a matter of time before he goes into the inlet of the skimmer. So just be aware that if you've got critters running around in the sump and you've got a bare exposure to your inlet of a pump such as a skimmer, then it's usually only a matter of time before he does actually figure out how to get there and get himself sucked in there. Because I assume that they think that's really fun, because that seems to be something that they do. So even just getting a little mesh, something that's not going to clog up, but is going to detract him from going into any of your pumps, is just a way of solving one of tomorrow's problems. Now, a protein skimmer is one of the most important tools for a saltwater aquarium. Now, how efficient the skimmer is very much governed by how often it's cleaned. So that cap comes off, and I would be suggesting that that cap gets a clean about twice a week, because it only takes a matter of days for fatty acids and bacteria and so forth to build up within the neck of that skimmer, and it reduces its efficiency, starts breaking down the absorbate that should be getting skimmed out. So I would be replacing or cleaning that cap twice a week, so I'm confident with its performance. Now, there's live rock and there's dead rock. Now, live rock, the porosity of live rock is completely different between one rock and another rock, because some live rock is very dense and some is much more porous. And the same with the fake rocks. They're not all made of the same consistency, but a lot of people will use rock for its biological properties, but between one rock and another rock, the biological properties will be completely different, because it's just whatever it is. Whereas if you use any of your medias, then it depends how much research has gone into those medias. Now, the only media that has had the research to build my trust is Marine Pure. And Marine Pure actually has a certain surface area to volume ratio and is completely interconnected, which means a microorganism could walk in one side of the rock, walk all the way through it, and then walk out the other side of the rock, because it's completely full of rooms and corridors within the internal structure of that particular media. So no matter what sort of fish tank I have, whether it be a garden pond, whether it be a reef tank, whether it be no matter what, the media that I go straight for is Marine Pure, because I know the research has been done and I get very good results from it. And I'm called to many services, and I will always recommend improving to Marine Pure, and it's common that I will get much better results out of the aquarium just by putting better media. Now, the media in your filter is like the engine of your car, and you could have a real flash looking engine that looks great, that doesn't perform properly. or you can have one that's researched and performs and everything works properly together. So having a good engine in your car is the secret to your car, and having good media in your filter is the secret to a good filter. Now, in reference to tuning your skimmer, the first thing you need to do to tune your skimmer is clean it. Because when you've got this layer here of bio cover, then your absorbate, which is what the skimmer is collecting, is going to get broken down. So as the bubbles go up, it's going to contact that bio level and break it down, and it's going to go back in. So if you clean it and that bio cover's gone, then you'll find instantly the bubbles start coming out because they're no longer restricted by that biological barrier. So the first thing you do to set the skimmer is clean it. Then once you've cleaned it, you want to set the bubbles so the white bubbles stay and the yellow bubbles come out. Now, if you run the skimmer wet, that means that any discolored bubbles come out. And if you run it dry, then the darker color is coming out. And the way that you set it is by restricting the outlet of the skimmer. So if the water can't come out fast because you shut the valve, the pressure will go up. If you open the outlet, the water will come out and the pressure will come down. So there's a knob that you just turn to turn it up or down, but you must clean it before setting it. The other things that will affect the skimmer is how high it's in the water, or how powerful the pump is, or how clean the pump is. Because it's also important to give the skimmer pump a bit of a clean at least once or twice a year. A necessary pain in the ass. Now, if you've got elevated phosphate levels, it's very common to try to reduce the amount of food that you're putting in the water. And that's a relatively effective way of helping to reduce your phosphates, by reducing the amount of food. But you can't do that at the expense of the fish. So the fish need to be fed. So if you start seeing that belly start to indent, then you've just got to take other action to reduce your phosphate and not do it at the expense of the fish. Because underfeeding fish, if I was a fish, I definitely wouldn't want to be underfed. So the fish like to have a nice full belly. So when you've got high phosphate, you definitely don't want to be overfeeding your fish, but at the same time, you don't want to be underfeeding them. So what you want to do is have a very good idea what that species is meant to look like. But in general, we want to see a little bit of a belly and then we're happy. We don't want to see a big fat belly, and we definitely don't want to see a sunken belly. So these fish in general are just a tad on the skinny side, which makes sense because phosphate has trying to be controlled. So the feeding has been a little bit lean. And that's okay, but only to a degree, because we don't want to make this phosphate problem the fish's problem. We want to keep that as your problem. So we want to use the other means we've got to reduce the phosphate without denying them their dinner. So these fish are very healthy fish, but some of them are just a tiny tad on the skinny side. So I would be feeding predominantly Spectrum's probiotics right now. I actually think the very best food for conditioning fish is Danichi, particularly Danichi color. But right now, considering this phosphate, I would be looking for Spectrum's probiotics. Now, the way that I'll feed the fish is I feed them about 5 times a week, so that's not every day. And then I'll just feed them a little sprinkle. And then over a month, I'm watching their bellies. And if over a month, I notice the belly's getting a little bit thin, then whatever I'm doing, I increase it. And then over a month, if I notice the belly's getting fat, then whatever I do, I'll decrease it. But you've got to be really patient. And you can't just say, oh, how many cubes are frozen or how many pinches do I put in? Because none of that's relevant. The only thing relevant is your observation. And if you see a fish on this fat side, you reduce whatever you're doing. If you see a fish on the thin side, you increase whatever you're doing. And just taking an interest in your fish and knowing what they should look like, and then making changes very slowly and being patient with waiting for the results is the key, because anything you change takes time to show up. It's called biological lag. Now, whether deciding to put corals into your aquarium, one of the biggest determining factors is going to be temperature in summer. Because an aquarium like this, which is a very beautifully functioning fish-only aquarium, is all good, but then the corals are more sensitive to temperature. So if you can't get a chiller on this tank and you start getting a really hot day, then it is possible that you lose your corals. Whereas your fish have got a bigger leniency for increased temperature. Providing you've got good oxygen level, the fish can handle the higher temperatures, whereas your corals are going to be more sensitive to it. So considering where to put a chiller is a big thing. And then just being aware that this issue of increased temperature is usually a problem when you're on holidays. Because when you're at home and you've got your fancy air conditioner running and you're keeping the house so it's nice and pleasant for you, you probably find your fish are okay. But when you're on holidays and you're not home, that's when you're gonna have disaster.